Imagine you're miles away from the nearest neighbor, enjoying a quiet night at home, when you realize the silence isn't because you're alone. It's because something outside is waiting for you to notice them. It was the middle of November, about 3 years ago. I had just finished a really stressful semester at university, and my girlfriend, Sarah, suggested we rent a small cabin for the weekend to just unplug and relax. She found a place online that was located about 4 hours north, tucked away in a heavily wooded area right on the edge of a frozen lake. We arrived at around 5 in the evening. By then, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow-covered driveway. The cabin was isolated. The nearest house was at least 2 miles back down the gravel road we came in on. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy in your ears. No wind, no birds, just the sound of our boots crunching on the ice. After we unpacked, I realized I'd left our bag of groceries in the trunk of the car. I walked back outside into the freezing air. The moon was sharp and bright, reflecting off the white ground so clearly that I didn't even need my flashlight. As I reached for the car door, I stopped. I felt that prickle on the back of my neck. You know the feeling when you're certain someone is standing right behind you. I turned around fast, scanning the dark tree line that circled the driveway. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just the transition from the city to the middle of nowhere. My mind was playing tricks on me. Inside, the cabin felt cozy. We spent the evening by the fireplace, talking and listening to music. But around 11:30 p.m., the atmosphere changed. Sarah was in the kitchen making tea when she suddenly went dead quiet. "Hey, did you hear that?" she whispered. I turned down the music. At first, I heard nothing. Then, a rhythmic tapping started. It was coming from the back of the house. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the siding with a single knuckle. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. I didn't want to look scared in front of Sarah, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I walked to the back window and pulled the curtain aside just an inch. There was a man standing on the back deck. He wasn't wearing a coat. He just had on a thin, dirty flannel shirt and tattered jeans. He was leaning against the railing, staring directly at the window. When the light from the cabin hit his face, he didn't flinch or run. Instead, he tilted his head and gave me this wide, vacant grin. His skin looked grayish, almost blue from the cold, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot. "Can I help you?" I yelled through the glass. My voice cracked. The man didn't move. He just kept smiling. Then, in a voice that was eerily calm and low, he said, "I think you left your lights on." I felt a jolt of confusion. I looked past him toward the driveway, but I couldn't see my car from that angle. I told him he needed to leave or I was calling the police. He didn't react to the threat. He just pointed a long, thin finger toward the front of the house and stepped back into the shadows of the trees. Sarah was already on her phone, but she looked at me with pure terror. "There's no signal," she said. "The bars are completely gone." I knew we had service when we arrived. Something was wrong. I told her to get her shoes on. We weren't staying there. I grabbed the car keys and we bolted out the front door, running toward the car. When we got to the driveway, I froze. My blood ran cold. All 4 tires on my sedan were completely flat. Not just leaked out, they had been sliced open. Long, jagged gashes ran through the rubber. And the man hadn't lied. My headlights were on, shining brightly into the dark woods, draining the battery. I realized then that he hadn't been trying to help. He wanted me to know he'd been at my car while we were inside. He wanted us to know we were stuck. "Inside! Get inside now!" I yelled. We scrambled back into the cabin and I slammed the deadbolt. I ran around the small house, locking every window and pulling every curtain. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the latches. We went to the center of the living room, as far from the windows as possible. That's when we heard the voices. Not just one, but 2 or 3 people, talking softly right outside the front door. "It's a nice car," one voice said. It sounded like a younger man. "They aren't going anywhere," another replied. I picked up the fire poker again, gripping it so hard my knuckles hurt. I felt completely helpless. We were trapped in a wooden box in the middle of a forest with no way to call for help. Suddenly, the front doorknob began to turn. Slowly, back and forth. Click, click, click. Then one of them knocked. It was a polite, gentle knock. "We know you're awake," a voice said from behind the wood. "We just want to come in and get warm. It's so cold out here." I didn't answer. I knew if I spoke, I'd lose my mind. Sarah was huddled on the floor, crying silently into her hands. For the next 4 hours, we sat in total silence. Every few minutes we would hear them. Sometimes it was a footstep on the porch. Sometimes it was a low laugh from under a window. They never tried to break the glass. They just hovered. They stayed right on the edge of our vision, letting us know they were there, waiting for us to crack. Around 4 in the morning, the sounds finally stopped. I stayed awake, staring at the door until the sun began to peek through the curtains. As soon as it was light, I looked out the front window. The driveway was empty. There were dozens of footprints in the snow, circling the entire cabin. They had walked around us hundreds of times while we sat there in the dark. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran. We didn't even pack our bags. We ran 2 miles down that frozen gravel road until we reached the main highway and flagged down a passing truck. The police went to the cabin later that day. They found my car, still sitting there on its rims, but the people were gone. The officers told us they found a makeshift campsite about half a mile into the woods, just some old blankets and rusted cans. They said it looked like a group of squatters had been living there for months. What haunts me the most isn't the man's smile or the sliced tires. It's what the police found on the back of the cabin. In the frost on the kitchen window, someone had traced the outline of Sarah's head while she was standing at the stove. They had been standing inches away from her, watching us through the glass, long before we ever heard that first tap. This happened 3 years ago, during the first week of October. I had just moved into a small, one-bedroom house on the edge of a quiet town in Ohio. It was an older place, surrounded by a lot of tall oak trees and a very long gravel driveway. I'm a freelance graphic designer, so I work from home and spend a lot of time by myself. I actually prefer the solitude, or at least I used to. It was a Tuesday night around 10:30 p.m. I was sitting on my couch in the living room, finishing up a project on my laptop. The only lights on in the house were the glow from my screen and a small lamp in the corner. It was a very windy night. I could hear the branches of the oak trees scraping against the siding of the house, which was a sound I was still getting used to. Suddenly, I heard a different sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the sliding glass door that leads out to my side porch. I froze. I looked over at the door, but the curtains were drawn shut. I figured it was probably just a heavy branch hitting the glass. I waited for a few seconds, but the tapping stopped. I went back to my work. About 5 minutes later, it started again. Tap, tap, tap. It was steady. It sounded like someone was using a single fingernail to knock on the glass. I felt a chill go down my back. I stood up and walked over to the door. I pulled the curtain back just a few inches to peek outside. Standing on my porch was a woman. She looked to be in her late 50s. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining. She wasn't looking at the door. She was staring straight ahead at the siding of the house, about 2 feet to the right of the glass. Her hand was raised, and she was slowly tapping on the glass without even looking at what she was doing. I felt a wave of confusion. I thought she might be a neighbor who was lost or perhaps had car trouble. I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. "Hello, can I help you?" I asked. The woman didn't turn her head. She kept staring at the wall. But she did stop tapping. She stood perfectly still. After a long silence, she spoke in a very flat, monotone voice. "I am looking for the basement," she said. I blinked. "The basement? There isn't a basement here. This house is built on a concrete slab. Are you okay? Do you live nearby? She finally turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were wide and didn't seem to blink. She had a very slight, empty smile on her face. "The basement is where the quiet stays," she said. Then she turned around and walked off the porch, disappearing into the darkness of the yard toward the trees. I stood there for a moment, feeling completely weirded out. I figured she might have dementia or some kind of mental health issue. I locked the sliding door, closed the curtains, and decided I was done working for the night. I went around the house and made sure every single window was locked. I went to bed around midnight. My bedroom is on the ground floor at the back of the house. I fell asleep fairly quickly, but I woke up at exactly 3:15 in the morning. The wind had died down completely. The house was silent. Then I heard a sound from directly underneath my bed. It was a soft, muffled scraping, like something heavy was being dragged across wood. But that was impossible. Like I told the woman, my house is built on a slab. There is no crawl space. There is no basement. There is only solid concrete under the floorboards. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was moving. It traveled from under my bed, across the floor toward the closet. I reached out and turned on my bedside lamp. The room looked normal. Nothing was out of place. I got out of bed, grabbing a heavy metal flashlight from my nightstand. I knelt down and shined the light under the bed. There was nothing there, just a few dust bunnies. Then, I heard a voice. It was faint, but it was coming from inside my bedroom closet. "It's much quieter down here," the voice whispered. It was the woman in the yellow raincoat. I backed away from the closet, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I bolted out of my bedroom, through the living room, and out the front door. I jumped into my car and drove to the gas station at the end of the road. I called the police from the parking lot. 2 officers met me at my house 10 minutes later. I stayed in my car while they went inside with their guns drawn. They searched the entire house. They checked the closet. They checked under the bed. They even checked the attic hatch in the hallway. They found no one. However, when they went into my bedroom, they found something that made my blood run cold. Inside my closet, the floorboards had been pried up. Beneath the wood, there was a hole in the concrete slab that I never knew existed. It was a small, hand-dug tunnel that led from the closet, under the foundation of the house, and out to a hidden opening in the woods behind the oak trees. The police found the yellow raincoat discarded near the exit of the tunnel in the woods. They also found a small pile of food wrappers and an old blanket inside the tunnel itself. Someone had been living under my floorboards for weeks. I never went back to that house. I broke my lease the very next day and moved into an apartment on the 3rd floor of a secure building. I still don't know who that woman was or why she was obsessed with my house. But every time I hear a floorboard creak in my new place, I have to remind myself, there is no basement.